Now working through a script that I enjoy a lot because it does so many things and provides such a great perspective to the data, no matter what you're working with, while at the same time teaching you a lot of complex scripting abilities. So first off, we're going to build complex conditional fields, and I want to walk through a variety of those, one of which will use the date field, and we're going to set the date up front, the format of the date, so that we can use it in a certain way. And again, it creates a way for you to more consistently apply date variables. We're going to be using these variables in dialog boxes, so they'll show up there as you'll see, and using them in file names themselves, so the file name will change depending on how you edit your variables. We're going to adjust the field names as well, and then one example of that is when you export field names as another field name. So there's a lot going on here. So invoice amount to could just be now total invoice amount when you export it to Excel. And we're really just maximizing the stratify command using this key field and then the crosstab function. And all of this is going to create a monthly stratification of your data. So you'll stratify your data, but then do it in a monthly format so that you can see month over month the change in activity, which again is really interesting, and I doubt anyone in your organization is running this. So it provides a different perspective that no one else is seeing right now. Going into ACL now, we have some scripts set up. I have a paid file that we're going to work off of. It has a check amount field, and it also has an enter date field, although we could use check date, enter date, whatever you'd like. And we're going to move into this stratification script. So taking a look at this script, what we've built here up front is a dialog box that will first select a paid file, and it's going to be putting it to an input variable. So that input variable we're going to use in a second here, and notice it's a project item drop-down list where we have tables selected, and we're putting that as the input. Okay, and we're going to then open up that input file, which is done here. Again, we're putting percentage marks around the word input in order to have ACL utilize it. And this gets a little different as we start working with variables. It's almost like you have to look back to refer back to how we're going to use certain variables later in the process, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now in the second dialog box, I could try to find it in here, but it may be a little bit difficult. So I may just show you it in the actual item itself. So I think this is the edit box here where we have that edit to input, but let's take a look here. When we go into this dialog box and edit it, notice here we have select the following fields from the, and it's blank. Now this is where we're going to put in the variable input, and that was that edit box that we saw there. Now, between you and me, I tend to not like working with the actual code itself in the dialog box. We're going to show you how to do some of it later, but it is a little cryptic to read. I mean, it's something where, yes, you can learn it, but just like working in DOS mode, this is kind of working in DOS mode, and changing this here, the word input, and where it's saying the edit box here, and where it is located in the actual dialog and the width itself. I think kind of moving to the Windows approach, selecting that, opening it up, and then just being able to add this edit box here, which is what we did. So we just kind of added an edit box there, and see if I can get rid of that. And then we in that edit box, we just put the word input in there. And by doing so, again, it's going to kind of bring that up as the variable or default value that you can then show, because you've already set it up here in that first dialog here. Okay, now we're just going to select the invoice amount and payment date. Now I'm going to change this, just for argument's sake, just to be amount. And in this date project item drop-down list, we've only isolated the date field. So that's the category that we brought over to that category list, and we're saving that to a variable called pay date. So I'm going to save changes to that dialog box so that we can have that. And moving forward now into the script. So now I wanted to talk through the first of our definition of fields where we're using a date variable. And you could do this any way you'd like in the set date format. So by setting date, what that is doing is in your options in ACL, you have the ability to set your date to whatever you'd like. And year, month, day, or whatever. Now I'm using this format. You could use anything, but we're saying set date, day, month, year. And then when we define the pay year month, now we're using some variables here. What I'm going to be doing is creating a new field that will, in essence, take the year and add to it the month, and that will be a text-based field. So we're going to actually have some text in, or character-based field that has the year and month added together. And to do that, we're going to take the date function of the pay date, which will convert that to a character. But knowing that the date format is day, month, year, that we can basically say we're going to then sub that at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 mark. So starting at the 7 mark and extending for 4. So that's going to kind of isolate that year of the date field, which is here. And then we're going to add on to that the month of that date field, which is done there. And then that would be starting at the 4 spot. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, I guess, in the way it calculates, and going for 2. So that is how we can create this month field, pay year month field, that we're going to show later. And we also create a pay year field, which is kind of just this part up here. And with that said, I'm not exactly sure we use this field later on. Except possibly in this key. Nope, we don't even use it there. So it's something where I think we just created this and left it for future reference. Okay, so the sorting on pay year month to sorted open is done so that we can now calculate a stratification. Now, in this stratification, we're going to have to be a little careful in that I have decided where things begin and end. Now, if you have data that has negative items that go to the negative billion mark, I would suggest creating a stratify range that goes to the negative billion mark. Now, in my data, actually the sample data we don't even have numbers that go anywhere near these limits. So it's really not something to worry about. But with your data, keep that in mind. We need to sort that on the pay year month, because notice back over here we have this key field. And that key field, if we look at any sort of stratification, let's kind of go to the stratify command here. In the more option, we have something called a break. And we want to break on a certain field. So in the break on a certain field, we're going to break on this pay year month. And what that's going to do is it's going to calculate a stratification for every different pay year month. The only difference is we need to sort it, because ACL will go through this, and if you have, let's say, July 2012 followed by January 2011 followed by July 2012, it's going to break at every one of those instances. So you need to kind of put it in order first and then apply the stratification command. Now let's go to our paid file, and in my table layout I have created this pay year month already based on the enter date. Have that all set up in there. I'll discard any changes, and then what we'll do is I'm going to sort on that particular field, pay year month, to a file called sorted. Now that I have that sorted, notice the enter date is pretty well sorted there. I'm going to run statistics on my check amount field. I always like to run statistics before you stratify, and then I'm going to stratify on the check amount field, accumulate check amount. Again, it gives you your minimum and maximum automatically. Noting my minimum and maximum, maybe I'll just put in here a 0. Let me just put in one negative item. So let me put negative 1,000, 0, 100, kind of powers of 10 here, going upwards. Okay, so that should cover us from a minimum maximum point of view. hit the OK button. Oop, forgot to do a lot of stuff actually. So in the break field, we want to select the pay year month, and that's going to now break on that pay year month, which is now sorted. And in the output file, we're going to hit the ACL table, and we can call this Stratify Test. And notice here, I now have a stratification by the month year with this 0, 100, 1,000, etc. And notice here that the 0 in this case is everything up until a 0, and this is everything up until 100, and this is everything up until 1,000, and continuing and forward from there. And then that check amount field, which let's take a look at this. It's called check amount, which is a little odd because we had a check amount field, and that's now become check amount 2. So it's now we now have two fields. The actual computed summary or accumulated field is this check amount 2. The item that just shows us what our strat range is now called check amount. Now let's go back into the stratification script now that we know that. And let's take a look at this more complex computed field that we've created. We actually have a couple of them. So the invoice amount in this particular case, the variable, was set in the dialog, and it was what we were calculating off of. And notice it's invoice amount. It's not invoice amount 2 or anything like that. The stratify range takes the form of whatever you named that amount field. And what we're doing here is we're saying, under 10 million would be items that are items up until a negative 10 million, and that's what that number is. Then this one would be everything from negative 10 million to negative 5 million, and negative 5 million to negative 1 million. And because what we have here is quite cryptic, what does that mean? I mean, we know it because we're ACL coding gurus, but for everyone else that is going to be reviewing these reports, that is more of a user reviewing it, they're never going to understand what that means. So what we're doing here is we're giving a much better name to every one of those fields. And we're now just adding things like 0 to 100, 101 to 500. So again, this is the upper limit, and that's why that upper limit is stated here. I just note, please make sure your data doesn't extend beyond this, because again, we can use this to help that process out with the under 10 million, but I think it's better to really kind of make the stratification work closer to the data that you're using as opposed to just using what I have here. Again, what we're also going to do is create another stratify item, which is a stratify order. And because up here, notice, this data, if I try to sort on this field now, it'll kind of create a jumbled mess probably. I mean, I think the 1001 would show up right underneath the 101. The 500 would end up way down here under the 10,000 and 100,000 because it would sort by 1, and then it would go to the next number, which is 2, and then it would go to the next number, which is 5, so it'd be a sorted mess. However, if we then create a stratify order field, which is computed this way, and just to be clear, I mean, we've done this more in the basic types of videos, but if you take a look here, we're creating a stratify order, define field stratify order, and we're computing it, and then underneath that we're basically adding a blank space, and in that blank space or carriage return, we then after that start our stratify order, which is all of our conditions. And after all the conditions are done, we then have this default value of 0, which really should never come up, but you have to have something. So we threw that in there as kind of a final item. So that's going to create the two defined fields that really drive a lot of this monthly stratification, or really the three of them. We have the pay year month, the stratify range, and the stratify order. So now we're going to talk through a couple of more interesting uses of variables. And this is something, I gotta be honest, I tend to have to remember a lot of times how these things are used and where we do things one way versus another. But this is where we're changing the names of variables. So again, this is a great script to go back to because it covers so many types of variable changes and usage that you really could use this as kind of your cheat sheet to get you back to understanding it. In this first one, notice how we had that check amount to. Now, invoice amount to, by creating this variable, I mean, one way of doing it is put the word assign in front of it, but let's not do that. We don't have to anymore. So we put invoice amount to equals invoice amount, which in this case would be check underscore amount, plus the number 2. So it's going to ultimately look like something like this. So that's now going to be that variable invoice amount to. Then below that we're going to have an output variable, which is the input file. Remember, in this case we had a paid file, and then we're going to add to that year month strat, and we're doing this in quotes just like we did above. And notice though, we're not using percentage marks here, right? Because that would confuse things. So we're not using that. We're just using, again, output now will be the input variable plus year month strat. So we'll have that as well. So now that we look at this export command down below, we can notice here one last thing, and talked about in the slide, is the pay year month as payment year / month. When we're exporting this data, that is how it's going to show up in the exported data. So instead of having this, somewhat more cryptic type of field name, you're going to have this one. Stratify range, stratify order, count as count, count percentage as percent of count. So we could say count percentage. What does that mean? Well, it's the percent of count. And you could call these things anything, but I kind of like this one here, as we're noting, where we have invoice amount to, which again, the invoice amount to we set up in this variable right here. So that invoice amount to is now being referred to as total invoice amount. So that's all going to be in this Excel output file. And what's the output file name? Again, it's paid file underscore year month strat. So in just a few statements here where we are assigning some variables here, and then using this export command with the as field names and using the output file, we're handling quite a bit here, and in just one small case. And keep in mind, you should refer back to this particular script, because it shows you, even though we're putting in percentage marks the output file as an example, you then have to put quotation marks around that variable that has percentage marks. So it's very different how we use these variables in the ACL scripting, depending on whether or not you're using it as a file name, or if you're using it as part, in line with the actual command itself. So moving now downwards into the script, we now calculated that stratification. We then exported that stratification, so that's useful. But then we want to cross-tab that stratification, and we're going to cross-tab on the stratify range field, which again is something that we had up above here, right? So that's here. And in cross-tabbing on that, we can then add in the columns category the pay year month, subtotaling on, and notice now how I do this a little bit differently here. Notice up here we could have had invoice amount to in quotes. I actually, so in other words, in percentage marks, so I could have done it like that, but purposely I did it like that just to show you again how you can use variables a little bit differently in ACL. In this case we can do invoice amount, which would be, in this case we use the word check underscore amount, and then just put a to right after it, so that's now how we can define that particular field in that crosstab query, and then that is going to go to a file called crosstab stratify value. And then I also did it on the volume itself, so we're subtotaling the value here first, and we could just get rid of this count field because we don't need it there, and then we're going to subtotal or stratify on the count separately. So I'm going to have a cross stratify value and a cross stratify volume. And down below here we're then just going to delete some of the temporary tables that were created in this process, so we don't need them, and we get rid of them. And let's run this, but then I want to show you how I want to make one last edit to this particular script to make it even better. But again, let's now run it so that we can see the results. So just closing the stratification script, I will save it. And by right-clicking and selecting Run, I can select the sample file, which we'll use the paid file in this case. Again, shows up here. In the amount, check amount. In the date, let's put that enter date. Hit OK. Does a couple of things. And now we have the year-month strat table, which is somewhat useful, but a little hard to read and utilize. But we did export that data. And then what I really like is this cross-stratify value. Now what's kind of interesting as you look at this is, again, it's not maybe sorted in the best possible way as we noted here, and hence why I wanted to play around with this. And as you look at the cross-tabulate, even though we don't have it here, you can cross-tabulate on multiple rows. So we're going to actually do that here in a second. So let's go back into our script for editing. So now going into the stratification script, we're actually going to go down to the stratify order computed field, but notice how this is a numeric field. So we could do this one of two ways, but it's best to keep it as a numeric for purposes of the sort order. It makes it a lot easier for sorting purposes. However, we want to create a new field, so we're going to create a stratify order character. And let's do this down by the crosstab. So what we can do here is we're going to say delete field, stratify order, CHR, OK. And that just, make sure that if it was there, it's going to delete it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say define field, stratify order, character. And in this case, we're going to take a string function of the stratify order field. And that string function, let's keep it to a 12, and maybe what I'll do is I'll all trim this particular item as well. So that is going to create this stratify order field. We're going to all trim it, but yet it's going to calculate that. And then now that we have this field, I can add that to my stratify range. So now that I have that field in there, and it needs to be a character field because you can't cross-tab on a value field, so we have to do it that way. But now that we have that, we can always convert it back to a numeric once we're into that cross-tab. So now that, we'll take this function here, and in each one of these cross-tab queries, we're going to then say, let's go back and create define field and delete field and define field. Now that we've cross-tabbed to this item, we're going to then open it. We're then going to delete the field stratify order. We're going to define the field stratify order. And in this case, we now need to convert it back to a value so that it's more useful for sorting purposes. And the field was called stratify order character, and we're just going to put a 0 after it. So now that we have that set up, we just got to be real careful here and just go back to the original file that we opened up. And the original file that we had way back up here was called the year month strat file. So we're going to open up year month strat. So just moving all the way down here to this crosstab, we first calculate the stratify order character. So just to maybe be careful here, we're just going to open year month strat again, just to kind of keep it simple here. We're then going to define that stratify order character field. We're going to cross tab on it using it. We're then going to, now that we've opened up that new table, the crosstab table, we're going to stratify on the value, or create a value of that. We're then going to do the whole process again, except this time we already have that first field defined in the year month strat. We have that character field defined, but we don't have this value field defined in this new crosstab. And again, we need to open up that crosstab. So let's be careful there. And in looking back now at the data, I'm seeing, or the actual defined statements, I forgot the word computed because this is a computed field. So we need to put the word computed wherever we're putting a defined field statement. So stratify order computed. And down below here, stratify order computed. And then everything else should work from there. So now let's run this one more time. And we're going to run it on the paid file. Check them out. Enter date. Everything seems to have run through. And now that I go to my value stratification, I can now sort in an ascending order on this item here. That's the character version of it. Let's go to the actual proper one and do a quick sort ascending. And notice here we actually have it sorted the way we want it. Looks really great over here, obviously. And then over here we have our values only in a more stratified format. And again, this is a really useful report because you can look across the next number of months and years and see how things change every month and year. And our goal here, especially if you put this into Excel and graph it, which is outside the scope of today, but if you do that, you're actually going to see trends in the data in certain months in a certain stratify category that you don't see in other fields or other months. And that's really interesting. I mean, just even looking at this kind of bogus data that we created here, in certain categories, you have data that really tends to be very, very consistent. I'm just looking at this whole row here. It's very consistent as you go across. Whereas other months, you see other data points popping out that never happen, except for maybe a month here, and it doesn't happen for a few more months. So it is a way of isolating change rather quickly from a time perspective and a size perspective.